They say time makes you forget. But time never made me forget the laughter of my children when they were young, the way they ran to me with gifts they couldn't afford. Now, they don't run. They don't even call. But that's all right. I've learned how to remember for all of us. My name is John Walker, and I am 62 years old. Some might say that's still young, but my bones disagree. My knees remind me of every roof I ever fixed, every fence I ever built, and every mile I ever drove to get home in time for my children's birthdays. I live in a small house on the edge of town, a place that's too quiet now. The porch out front has 2 rocking chairs, but only one ever moves. The other sits still, facing the same sunset my late wife used to love. Her name was Margaret, and even after 5 years without her, I still find myself turning to speak to her when the wind picks up. It's funny how silence can sound like someone you miss. This year, my birthday came and went like an unnoticed breeze. I woke up early, made myself coffee, and checked my phone. No calls, no messages. I told myself they were busy. My children always were. Life had given them long to-do lists, new homes, new worries. I told myself not to expect much. Expectations are the surest way to break your own heart. By noon, the quiet felt heavier. I watched the sunlight crawl across the porch, touching the same floorboards I built 30 years ago. Margaret and I used to celebrate with cake, even when we were broke. She'd make it from scratch, a small, lopsided thing, but sweet enough to taste like love. We'd light one candle, laugh, and say, one wish for next year. My wish back then was always the same, that our children would grow up kind. When the sun started to set, I finally gave up on the phone. I told myself I'd have a quiet dinner. I made soup. It tasted fine, but there's something about eating alone that turns food into something dull, like chewing on memory. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I saw the last bit of sunlight fade. That's when I exhaled, slow and tired, as if the air itself carried the weight of being forgotten. Later that evening, I sat out on the porch with a glass of whiskey. My father used to drink the same brand, the kind that burns a little on the way down, enough to make you feel alive, even when your heart doesn't. I scrolled through my phone again, not for messages this time, but for distraction. My thumb stopped when I saw my daughter's post. There she was, smiling in a fancy restaurant, holding a glass of champagne. The caption said, "Celebrating life with my favorite people." I wasn't in the picture. I wasn't even in the thought. I smiled. Not the kind of smile you mean, but the kind you wear to stop tears from forming. My son had posted a new car photo, said he bought it for the family. The irony stung, but I just nodded. I poured another drink and stared into the night sky, where the stars were sharp and clear, uncaring of birthdays or silence. I used to think forgetting a birthday was harmless. People get busy, time moves fast. But it wasn't the first year they forgot. It was the 5th. 5 years of quiet messages that never came. 5 years of being the one to call first, only to be met with hurried voices saying, "I'll call you back, Dad." 5 years of not hearing that call back. I suppose the real hurt isn't being forgotten. It's realizing you've become optional to the people you built your life around. My heart didn't break that night. It just grew quieter, heavier, wiser. Margaret always said I had a long memory. "You remember too much, John," she used to tease. "One day you'll remember the whole world, and no one will remember you." She was right about the remembering part, but I never thought the rest would come true so soon. I went back inside and opened the old wooden chest at the foot of my bed. Inside were photo albums, letters, and one thing I never let anyone touch, a small black notebook. Its cover was cracked, its pages yellowed from years of being opened, closed, and opened again. I started writing in it the year Margaret died. I didn't plan to. Grief just needed somewhere to live. The notebook became that place. It held everything, small thoughts, memories, and sometimes anger. Over time, it became more than that. It became my memory's proof. I turned to a blank page and wrote the date. 62 years old today. No calls, no visits, just me. Then I paused, staring at the ink until it blurred. Underneath, I wrote something new. They forgot, but I will remember. You see, memory is a gift. But it's also a weapon. The older you get, the sharper it becomes, especially when people mistake your quietness for weakness. That night, I realized something. I didn't need them to remember me. I just needed them to remember who I was. So I decided to keep remembering, not out of spite, but out of purpose. For every year they forgot me, I would remember something they didn't want remembered. Every promise they broke, every lie they told, every favor they owed, all of it would live in that notebook. The funny thing about growing old is that people assume you stop paying attention. They think your memory fades like the paint on the porch rail. But they forget that the longer you live, the more you notice. You see who calls only when they need something. You hear what isn't said in their voices. You remember the small things that reveal the truth. I sat there that night, looking out into the dark yard where the oak tree stood tall, the one we planted when our first child was born. Its branches swayed gently, whispering like Margaret's voice in the wind. I imagined her saying what she always did when I got quiet like this. "John, don't you go turning bitter. Just let time do the teaching." Maybe I've let time teach me too long, I thought. Maybe it's time I did some teaching of my own. The clock ticked past 11:45 when I finally stood up. The house creaked like it was sighing with me. I took the black notebook to my desk, placed it down, and stared at it for a long time. I wasn't planning revenge. Nah, this wasn't about payback. It was about balance, about reminding the people who'd forgotten their roots that roots don't forget. As I closed the notebook, I felt a strange calm settle in. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't hoping for a message. I was remembering, deliberately, fully. And in that moment, I realized something beautiful. The opposite of being forgotten isn't being remembered by others. It's remembering yourself. That night, I slept better than I had in months. Not because anyone called, but because I finally understood what I needed to do. Tomorrow, I would start with the past. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise, like I always do. The house was still and quiet, the kind of quiet that used to mean peace, but now just meant absence. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood by the kitchen window, watching the world outside slowly brighten. The oak tree in the yard swayed gently, its leaves catching the light. That tree had seen it all. It had heard laughter, arguments, tears, and more birthdays than I could count. I sometimes thought it remembered better than my own children did. As I drank, I thought about them, my 3 children. Michael, my eldest, Claire, my middle child, and Daniel, my youngest. Each one different, each one carrying a piece of me and their mother in ways they probably never noticed. Michael was the leader, or at least he always believed he was. He inherited my stubbornness, but none of my patience. When Margaret passed away, he took charge of the funeral arrangements. He spoke well, strong and confident, but I could see his hands shaking when he thought no one was watching. Afterward, he never quite came home again. His work became his excuse, and distance became his shield. He called once every few weeks at first, then once a month, then only on holidays. Eventually, not at all. Claire was different. She was gentle when she was young, always helping her mother in the kitchen, humming songs she made up. She wanted to be a nurse. But when Margaret died, something hardened in her. She started to look at me not as her father, but as a reminder of everything she lost. She married young, a man named Peter who smiled more with his teeth than his heart. I never liked him. He didn't like me either, though he pretended well enough when he wanted something. Daniel, the youngest, was my quiet one. He and I used to go fishing together, sometimes sitting for hours without a word. He was the one who held my hand at Margaret's grave when everyone else walked away. But life took him far. He moved overseas for work, promised to visit, and for a while he did. Then the visits stopped. First the calls, then the messages, until eventually he became a voice I only heard in dreams. I took another sip of coffee, feeling that old ache in my chest again. Parents don't stop loving their children, even when they stop being loved in return. But love changes shape. It becomes quieter, heavier, something you carry alone. I remember the last birthday they all celebrated with me. It was my 57th. Margaret had been gone 2 years. They all came, Michael with his wife and 2 kids, Claire with that husband of hers, and Daniel still living close by then. We had dinner on the porch. The laughter felt forced, but I pretended not to notice. I remember watching them eat the cake and thinking how grown up they looked, how proud Margaret would have been. But when I blew out the candles, I looked up and saw something missing in their eyes. It wasn't love, not exactly. It was connection. They were already somewhere else in their minds, wrapped up in their own lives, and I was just part of a routine. It hurt, but I smiled anyway. Margaret used to say birthdays were reminders of who still cared. You can measure a heart by who shows up, she said once. I didn't believe it then. I do now. After she passed, I tried to keep us together. Every Sunday I'd cook dinner. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, her apple pie recipe, the kind of meal that makes a house feel full. They came at first. Then they started coming late. Then they stopped coming at all. "We'll come next week, Dad," they said. But next week never came. I don't blame them entirely. The world moves fast now. Everyone's busy chasing something. Success, money, validation, whatever it is that fills the silence when love gets quiet. I just wish they'd realize that time doesn't pause for guilt. One day you plan to visit, and the next day there's no one left to visit. I finished my coffee and set the cup down on the counter. The black notebook sat open on the table beside me. I looked at the words I'd written last night. They forgot, but I will remember. The ink had dried deep and dark, as if sealing a promise. I flipped through the pages, reading old entries. Notes about the day Claire was born, the day Michael graduated, the time Daniel broke his arm falling from the oak tree. Margaret's handwriting appeared on one page, a list she made of all our birthdays and anniversaries. She wrote in delicate cursive, always with a blue pen. I ran my fingers over her name, feeling the indentation of her writing. That small pressure was all that remained of her touch. Then I turned to the later pages, the years after her death. The handwriting changed. It became tighter, sharper. The words grew shorter. Michael missed dinner. Claire canceled last minute. Daniel postponed the visit again. It read less like a journal and more like a record. Soil, a quiet ledger of absence. I remembered the first time I wrote something angry in that notebook. It was the night Michael called asking for money. He said he needed it for a business investment. I didn't ask questions, just transferred what he needed. Later, I found out it was for his wife's shopping spree. That night I wrote, "He lies easily now." I underlined it twice. Then came Claire. She visited once, bringing Peter along. I overheard them in the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. They were arguing about selling the house when I died. Peter said, "He's sitting on prime property." I remember that phrase word for word. Prime property. Like my life was just a plot of land waiting to be cleared. Daniel was different. His betrayal wasn't loud. It was quiet neglect. He stopped replying to my messages for months. Then, one day, he sent me a text. "Hey, Dad, sorry I've been busy. Hope you're good." No call. Just that. That was the last I heard from him. As I sat there flipping through those pages, I realized something. The notebook wasn't just for me anymore. It was a map of how we got here. Every entry a step away from family. Every silence a brick in the wall between us. I closed it gently, like putting a child to sleep. Then I walked to the living room and picked up the picture frame on the mantel. It was taken 15 years ago, all of us standing under the oak tree. Margaret in her favorite blue dress, me with my arm around her, the kids all smiling. That smile, I'd memorized it, even though I knew most of it was for the camera. Still, I loved that photo. I still do. But that morning, as the light came through the window, the glass reflected my own face over theirs. Older, lonelier, but still here. I set the frame down and whispered, "You are right, Margaret. They've all forgotten how to show up." The air didn't answer, but I felt something shift inside me. I realized that love and disappointment often live in the same room. I decided I wouldn't chase them anymore. No more reminders, no more calls, no more waiting by the phone. If they remembered, they remembered. If they didn't, well, I had my notebook, my memories, and the oak tree. Sometimes that's enough. But as I stood there, I felt a spark of something I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was resolve. Either way, I knew one thing. I might be old, but I wasn't invisible. They'd forgotten me, but I still remembered everything about them. Their birthdays, their habits, their secrets. And one day soon,
I'd remind them. The days after my birthday felt longer than usual. The mornings stretched into silence, and the nights seemed to whisper reminders of what I'd lost. I tried to keep my mind busy, fixing small things around the house: the loose hinge on the pantry door, the squeaky porch step, the broken lamp in the corner that hadn't worked since Margaret passed.
It was strange how fixing things made me feel both useful and hollow at the same time. Every morning I checked my phone, pretending it was out of habit, not hope. Still, no calls. Not from Michael, not from Claire, not from Daniel. Nothing. A man shouldn't measure his worth by the sound of a ringtone, but after a while, silence starts to feel like a verdict. One evening, 3 days after my birthday, I decided to walk down to the general store. The air smelled like rain, and the gravel crunched beneath my boots. People waved, the kind of polite wave you give an old man you vaguely recognize. I nodded back, pretending I didn't notice how many of them looked at me with that quiet sympathy reserved for the lonely. At the counter, I ran into Mrs. Green, an old friend of Margaret's. She smiled warmly. "John, happy belated birthday," she said, her voice soft, like she was afraid to hurt me with the words. "Thank you, Martha," I said, forcing a smile. "Did the kids come by?" she asked. It was a harmless question, but it landed like a stone. "No," I said, shaking my head. "They're busy these days. Life, you know." Her face softened with that look, pity disguised as politeness. "Well, I'm sure they'll make it up to you." I nodded again. "Maybe," I said, but I knew they wouldn't. The truth was, they'd stopped making things up a long time ago. I bought my groceries, bread, coffee, and a can of paint I didn't need, and walked home under the gray sky. When I got back, I sat on the porch and watched the first drops of rain hit the railing. The smell of wet earth filled the air, and for a moment, I felt Margaret beside me again. I closed my eyes and whispered, "They forgot again, love." But I remember. That night after dinner, I poured another small glass of whiskey and scrolled through my phone. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but I found something anyway. Claire's new post. She was at a restaurant again, all dressed up, smiling beside Peter. "Celebrating life," the caption read. The same word she'd used before. Celebrating life. I stared at it for a while, wondering if she ever thought of me while she celebrated hers. Then I saw Michael's latest post, his family on vacation. Sunlight, beaches, laughter. His wife holding up a cocktail, the kids building sandcastles. "Family time is everything," he'd written. I let out a dry laugh. "Everything," he said. "Everything but me." Daniel hadn't posted anything new, but I noticed something that stung even worse. He'd been online, active 2 hours ago. No message, not even a "Hey, Dad." I stared at the screen for a long time, feeling that mix of sadness and anger that only neglect can bring. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the rain tapping on the roof. My thoughts wandered back to the notebook on my desk. It was open to the last page I'd written. "They forgot, but I will remember." The words looked darker in the dim light, almost as if the ink itself carried a promise. I got up, turned on the lamp, and picked up the notebook. I flipped to a new page and wrote the date. Then I started writing, not about myself, but about them. I wrote down their birthdays, their anniversaries, the days they called, and the days they didn't. I wrote memories, both good and bad, the ones they thought I'd forgotten. Michael's 12th birthday, the day I surprised him with his first bicycle. He rode it down the street and crashed into the mailbox. I remembered running to him, worried sick, and he laughed with blood on his knee, saying, "I'm fine, Dad. I just want to try again." Back then, he never gave up on anything. Somewhere along the way, he stopped trying when it came to me. Claire's 17th birthday. I spent all night building her a bookshelf because she said she wanted a place for her nursing textbooks. The next morning, she hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. Now I'd give anything for that hug again. Daniel's 10th. We spent the whole day fishing. He didn't catch a thing, but when we got home, he told his mother, "I caught time with Dad." Margaret cried when she heard that. She said that boy's heart is bigger than his future. She was right. He used to love deeply. I wondered when that love grew quiet. As I wrote, something inside me shifted. I wasn't writing out of bitterness anymore.
I was documenting truth, the kind of truth people forget when they grow too busy chasing everything that doesn't matter. By the time I stopped, it was past midnight. I closed the notebook, ran my fingers over the cover, and whispered, "You were right, Margaret. They've all moved on." The next morning, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went through the old boxes in the attic. Dust and time had turned everything up there gray. But as I dug through it, the past came alive again. Photographs, Margaret's letters, the kids' drawings from school. I found an envelope marked John for later. Inside was a letter from Margaret, written in her familiar blue ink. It said, "If you ever feel forgotten, remember that love doesn't die. It changes homes. Ours lives in memory. Use it kindly, but don't let anyone steal your peace." I sat there for a long while, holding that letter, her words echoing in my head. Use it kindly. That was just like her. Always the voice of compassion, even when life wasn't kind to her. But as I read it again, I realized something else. Don't let anyone steal your peace. Maybe that was her way of telling me not to stay silent anymore. Maybe remembering wasn't enough. Maybe it was time to remind them.
That night, I sat on the porch again with the notebook open beside me. The wind rustled through the oak tree, and I could almost hear her voice in it. "Teach them, John," it seemed to say, "but teach them gently." I looked up at the stars and whispered, "All right, Margaret, I'll do it your way." The plan wasn't clear yet, but the intention was. I wasn't going to confront them with anger. No shouting, no accusations, just truth. Calm, undeniable truth. The kind that makes people remember not because you force them to, but because they can't forget what they've done. I woke up early the next day with a different kind of clarity. Not the bitter kind that comes from anger, but the quiet kind that follows understanding. I finally knew what I needed to do. I wasn't going to wait for them to remember me. I was going to remind them, calmly, completely, and in my own way. I started by pulling out 3 envelopes from my desk drawer, each one thick, sturdy, the kind that feels important when you hold it. I wrote their names on them in black ink: Michael, Claire, Daniel. My handwriting shook a little, but I took my time. Margaret always said my handwriting looked like a man trying to hold back emotion. Maybe she was right. Then I opened the notebook again and began rereading the memories I'd written. Each page carried weight, not just sadness, but truth. Truth they had forgotten, truth they had buried, truth they needed to see again. I began with Michael. I wrote, "Dear Michael," and paused. His name alone brought back a flood of images. Him as a boy, covered in mud, grinning up at me after falling off that bike. Him as a teenager, standing on the porch, shouting that I was holding him back because I couldn't afford to send him to that private college. Him as a man, too busy for his father, too proud to look back. I continued, "You were my first pride, my first proof that I could be more than a poor carpenter with calloused hands. When you got your first job, I stood outside your office in my truck just to see you walk out wearing that suit. I wanted to see the man I raised standing tall. You didn't see me that day, and that's all right. I didn't want you to. I just wanted to remember that all those long nights working late were worth it." I stopped to breathe. Then I wrote the rest. "I know about the money, the business investment you said you needed help with. I didn't say anything when I found out it was a lie, because fathers forgive quietly. I gave you that money because I wanted you to know I still believed in you. But you've mistaken my silence for weakness. You should know this. Your father is not weak. He just chose love over confrontation, always." When I finished his letter, my hands trembled. I sealed it, placed it to the side, and reached for another envelope. "Dear Claire," I wrote. That one hurt more. Daughters have a way of carving themselves into a father's heart. Claire was my mirror of Margaret, gentle eyes, soft voice, but a will strong enough to move mountains. I remembered her sitting on the kitchen counter as a child, swinging her legs and humming while Margaret baked. I could still hear that song sometimes when the wind passed through the curtains. I wrote, "You once told me I was your hero. You said I made you feel safe, that you wanted to be like me. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being that person for you. Maybe it was after your mother passed. Maybe it was when I couldn't give you everything you wanted, but I never stopped trying. I hesitated before continuing. I know about the night you and Peter talked about selling the house. I wasn't asleep, Claire. I heard every word. Prime property, he said. I didn't interrupt because I wanted to hear how far you'd go. You didn't say much that night, but your silence said enough. Still, I forgave you. Because forgiveness isn't about who deserves it, it's about who needs peace. And I needed mine. Tears blurred the ink for a moment. I wiped him away, signed my name, and sealed that envelope too. Finally, I reached for the third. Dear Daniel. Daniel was the hardest to write to because his distance wasn't built on greed or malice. It was built on time and neglect. Sometimes that's worse. Daniel, my quiet boy. You were always the one who listened, the one who sat beside me when everyone else walked away. You told me once that when you grew up, you'd take care of me. I never wanted you to. I only wanted you to remember where you came from. I don't blame you for leaving. The world is big and tempting. But don't forget this. The man you became is built on the love of the man you left behind. I closed my eyes for a long moment after writing that. Then I added one more line. I kept your mother's last letter. She mentioned you in it. She said you had the kindest heart, the kind that could save this family if it ever fell apart. I think she was right. But a heart, no matter how kind, can only be remembered if it returns home. When I sealed the third letter, I felt something settle inside me, like closing a chapter. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. The house felt lighter, the silence less cruel. I decided I would not mail the letters. No, I wanted to hand them each one in person. Not to shame them, not to lecture, but to look into their eyes and remind them that memory is not a burden, it's a responsibility. That night, I made myself a list of birthdays. Theirs, their spouses, their children. Every one of them neatly written in the notebook, besides small notes of the things I remembered about each day. Michael's son, Peter Jr., loved baseball. His birthday was coming up next month. Claire's daughter Emma turned 16 soon. She wanted to learn to drive. Soil, Daniel's birthday was the last of the year, in November. I smiled at that. It gave me time to plan. The next morning, I walked into town and stopped by the florist. I hadn't been there in years. The woman behind the counter recognized me. "John Walker," she said. "It's been a while." "It has," I replied. "I need 3 bouquets, simple ones. White lilies, please." She nodded. "For a funeral?" she asked gently. "No," I said, smiling faintly. "For a memory." I picked them up the next day and placed them in vases around the house. One on the table, one by Margaret's picture, and one on the porch. It wasn't for them. It was for her. For the peace she'd left behind, the peace I was now trying to reclaim. Over the next week, I prepared. I gathered old photos, copied pages from my notebook, and placed them neatly into a folder labeled "For My Children." On the cover, I wrote one line, "What you choose to forget, I remember." I planned the dinner for a month later, near the end of summer. It would be my way of celebrating a birthday they'd all missed, a gathering they wouldn't understand until it began. I called it a family reunion. I told them I had something important to share. Each of them agreed to come, surprised but polite. When I hung up the last call, I looked out at the oak tree again. Its branches swayed like an approving nod. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of calm. Not from being remembered, but from knowing that soon I would remind them of everything. And this time, they would listen. Not because they wanted to, but because the truth has a way of echoing louder than silence ever could. The day of the dinner arrived with the kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. The sky was the color of faded silver, the air warm and heavy, just on the edge of summer rain. I woke before dawn, as I always do, and brewed coffee while the house still slept. Then I stood on the porch, looking out at the oak tree. Its leaves shimmered with dew, and I thought about all the years it had stood there, growing alongside my family, the same family that had forgotten me until now. I spent the morning cleaning the house. I dusted the old family photographs, straightened the frames, and laid the table in the dining room. It had been years since all 3 of my children had sat around that table. The thought stirred something deep in my chest, a blend of longing and resolve. The table felt both sacred and heavy,
a monument to what once was. At 6 o'clock, the first car pulled into the driveway. It was Michael, of course, always the first to arrive when there's something he doesn't understand but suspects might be important. He stepped out, adjusting his tie like he was heading into a meeting rather than a reunion. His wife stayed in the car, scrolling on her phone. I stepped out to greet him.
"Dad," he said, giving a stiff nod, "you look good." "I'm still breathing," I said with a half smile. "That's good enough." He chuckled awkwardly and followed me inside. "So what's this about? You sounded serious." "You'll see," I said. "Let's wait for your sister and brother." He shrugged and sat down in the living room, eyeing the photographs like they were part of an exhibit he'd forgotten he'd once belonged to. 15 minutes later, Claire's car arrived. She stepped out in a pale blue dress, just like her mother used to wear, though the resemblance stopped there. Peter came with her, holding a bottle of wine he clearly thought would buy him forgiveness for everything I'd overheard. "Dad," Claire said, smiling too brightly, "this is nice. Feels like old times." "Old times were different," I said softly. "Back then, people stayed a little longer." Her smile faltered for a second, then she walked past me into the house, pretending she hadn't heard. Finally, near 7, I heard the low hum of Daniel's rental car. He got out slowly, his face tired but warm. "Hey, Dad," he said quietly. "Sorry it's been so long." I looked at him for a moment before replying. "You made it. That's what matters." When they were all seated around the table, the house felt alive again, almost too alive. The air buzzed with unspoken things, the kind of tension that builds when everyone's pretending to be comfortable. Claire poured wine, Michael checked his watch, Daniel kept glancing at me, sensing something beneath the surface. I watched them all, and for a moment I saw them as they used to be. 3 children with sticky hands and cake on their faces, laughing so loud Margaret had to shush them. That memory hit me like a punch to the heart. "I'm glad you all came," I began. "It's been a long time since we sat together like this." Michael leaned back, trying to sound casual. "So, Dad, what's the big news? You're not selling the house, are you?" I smiled faintly. "No, son, not yet." Claire frowned. "Not yet? What does that mean?" "It means I want to tell you something first," I said, reaching for the folder beside me. "Something I've been holding on to." I placed it on the table, right in the middle, where Margaret used to set the breadbasket. 3 envelopes sat inside, one for each of them. "I wrote you letters," I said, "not because I'm leaving anything behind, but because I want you to remember what you've already had." Michael sighed. "Dad, is this really necessary? We're here, aren't we?" "Yes," I said, "but being here isn't the same as remembering why." I handed them their letters. No one spoke. The sound of paper unfolding filled the silence. Michael read first. His eyes moved quickly across the page, then slowed. His jaw tightened, the color draining from his face. When he reached the end, he looked up at me. "You knew about that?" he asked, voice low. "I did," I said. "I knew the day you called it an investment. I just decided to believe in the boy I raised, not the man who lied to me." He looked away, ashamed. "Dad, Finish reading," I said. "Then we'll talk." Claire's turn came next. She hesitated halfway through her letter, blinking hard. Peter shifted uncomfortably beside her, sensing the storm before it broke. When she reached the part about the conversation I'd overheard, her face went pale. "You were awake that night?" she whispered. "I was," I said. "I heard every word, and I forgave you before the morning came." She covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean—" "I know," I said. "You were grieving, so was I. But grief doesn't excuse forgetting who we are." Daniel hadn't opened his letter yet. He just stared at it, fingers trembling. Finally, he said, "Dad, I already know what's in there." "Do you?" I asked gently. He nodded. "That I left, that I stopped calling, that I let work and life get in the way." "It's more than that," I said. "Open it." He did. He read quietly, lips moving slightly as his eyes traced the words. When he reached the part about his mother's letter, the one where she said his heart could save the family, he closed his eyes. His shoulders shook once, then steadied. He whispered, "I remember that day, the fishing trip. You told me that time spent together is never wasted." "A minute," I said. "So what is this, Dad? Are you trying to make us feel guilty?" No, I said softly. I'm trying to make you remember. You've all built lives that look perfect from the outside, but somewhere along the way, you stopped looking back. You stopped showing up. You forgot the birthdays, the dinners, the calls. You forgot me. But I never forgot any of you. The room went silent. Even Peter, who always had something smug to say, kept his mouth shut. The only sound was the soft creak of the house settling, like it was listening too. I reached for the final envelope in the folder, one addressed to all three. I slid it forward. This one's for all of you. Read it together. Daniel picked it up and began to read aloud. If you're holding this, it means you came back. Maybe out of guilt, maybe out of curiosity, or maybe because something in your heart still remembers what family feels like. Whatever the reason, thank you. These walls remember laughter. This table remembers your mother's voice. The porch remembers your footsteps. And I remember everything. He paused, his voice trembling, but he kept reading. I don't need gifts or apologies. Soil, I don't need you to say you're sorry for forgetting my birthday. What I need is for you to remember your own, to remember the people who gave you life, who stood behind you, who stayed silent when it hurt to speak. Because silence, my children, is not weakness. It is patience, and patience, when it's taken for granted, eventually becomes a teacher. When he finished, none of them spoke for a long time. Then Claire reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cold, trembling. "Dad," she said softly, "I'm sorry." Michael nodded slowly, eyes wet. Me too. Daniel didn't say anything. He just stood up, walked around the table, and hugged me, tight, like he did when he was 10 years old. I closed my eyes, letting that warmth sink into my chest. For the first time in years, the silence in the house didn't hurt. It healed. After a moment, I said, "I didn't bring you here to punish you. I brought you here to remind you that family doesn't end until we stop showing up. I just needed you to remember before it was too late." Claire wiped her eyes. "You could have just told us." I smiled. "I tried. You weren't listening." They all laughed softly, the kind of laughter that comes after tears. It filled the room, slow and real. Margaret would have liked that sound. When dinner ended, they stayed longer than I expected. Michael washed dishes, Claire packed leftovers, and Daniel helped me fix the light above the porch. For once, no one checked their phone. The house felt full again. As they were leaving, I stood on the porch watching them hug one another. Michael turned back and said, "We'll come next Sunday, for dinner." "I'll be here," I said. When the last car drove away, I sat back down in my rocking chair. The oak tree swayed gently in the wind, whispering approval. I looked up at the night sky and said quietly, "They remembered, Margaret. They finally remembered." And for the first time in a long, long while, I felt at peace. The morning after the dinner, the house smelled like coffee and rain. The storm from the night before had passed, leaving behind that soft, clean scent that always reminded me of beginnings. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards still damp beneath my feet, and sat in my usual chair. The oak tree shimmered under the sunlight, drops of water glistening on its leaves like tiny reminders that even after darkness, something beautiful can still remain. The quiet was different now, not empty, not heavy, just peaceful. For the first time in years, I didn't wake up wondering if anyone remembered me. I didn't check my phone, I didn't wait for a message that would never come. Instead, I just sat there, feeling the warmth of the morning settle on my face, and thought about the sound of my children's laughter echoing through the house the night before. They had stayed late, talking about things we hadn't talked about in years. Daniel had gone through the old photo albums with me, pointing out memories he'd forgotten, laughing at his own messy handwriting in his school projects. Claire had washed dishes while humming softly, just like her mother used to do. Michael, for once, didn't rush off to answer a call or check an email. He just sat at the table, staring at the empty plates, deep in thought. When he left, he hugged me a second time. He hadn't done that since he was a boy. The truth is, I didn't expect anything to change after that dinner. People don't transform overnight. But I had seen something in their eyes, awareness. That was enough for me. Sometimes awareness is the first step toward love. As the sun rose higher, I opened my black notebook. The pages were nearly full now. I ran my fingers over the ink-stained lines, reading the story of my own heart. The entries from the earlier years were sharp with pain, full of quiet disappointments and lonely evenings. But the more recent ones had softened. The last one I'd written, the night before the dinner, simply said, "Tomorrow, I teach them how to remember." Now, I took my pen and wrote again. Today, they remembered. And I remembered too, not just the hurt, but the love that came before it. The truth is, love doesn't disappear when it's forgotten. It just waits, patient as an old man on a porch, for someone to sit beside it again. When I put the pen down, I smiled. Margaret would have been proud. She always believed in second chances. For others, for me, for the children. She used to say, "We're all guilty of forgetting sometimes, but forgiveness is what keeps memory alive." The wind picked up, and I swear I could hear her laughter in it, soft and familiar. I closed my eyes, letting that sound settle in my chest. "You were right again, love," I whispered. "Forgiveness is remembering without pain." Over the next few weeks, something remarkable happened. My phone began to ring again. First, a message from Daniel, a picture of him fishing with the caption, "Wish you were here, Dad." Then a call from Claire, just to check in, no reason at all. She talked for half an hour about her garden, her job, and how she'd started baking again. And then Michael called, not to ask for help, not to talk about work, but just to talk. We laughed about old stories, the kind that only fathers and sons can share. He said, "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about showing up. I think I forgot how to do that." "You remembered now," I said gently. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Yeah, I guess I did." A few Sundays later, they all came back, just like Michael promised. The house came alive with the smell of food and laughter again. Daniel grilled outside while the kids played near the oak tree. Soil Claire brought her apple pie, using her mother's old recipe, and Michael helped me fix the loose shutter by the kitchen window. For once, it wasn't just a visit, it felt like family again. After dinner, when everyone was gathered around the table, I raised my glass of iced tea and said, "You know, I used to think memory was a punishment, that remembering everything, the pain, the silence, the loneliness, was too heavy to carry. But now I see it's a gift. It's how we keep love alive, even when it's gone quiet." Claire smiled through tears. "You always find the right words, Dad." I laughed softly. Took me 62 years to find them. As the evening faded, I stepped out onto the porch, letting them talk and laugh inside. The sound of my family carried through the screen door, that soft hum of life that used to fill this house when Margaret was still here. I looked up at the oak tree, its branches swaying gently, and thought about all the birthdays that had come and gone. The forgotten ones, the painful ones, the ones filled with laughter. Each of them mattered. Each of them had shaped us. I sat down in my chair and rocked slowly, listening to the sounds of life behind me. It felt like the porch itself was breathing again. I thought about how strange it was, how a man can live a whole life surrounded by noise and yet only understand its meaning once he's lived through silence. Before going inside, I opened my notebook one last time and wrote a final entry. They forgot my birthday once, but I remembered every one of theirs. And their secrets, their mistakes, their kindness, their laughter. Because remembering isn't just about keeping score. It's about keeping love alive long enough for it to find its way back home. I closed the notebook and placed it on the porch table. The sun was setting, painting the yard in gold and amber light. Somewhere in that glow, I felt Margaret near me again, not as a memory, but as peace. And as I sat there, surrounded by laughter, forgiveness, and the sound of the wind in the trees, I realized the greatest gift wasn't in being remembered. It was in never forgetting who you are, even when everyone else does.